Bullies choke Farmhand. He slammed them into the mud instantly. Zephyr Whitlock wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hefted another bale of hay onto the truck bed, his wiry frame straining under the weight. Standing barely 5'6", with arms like matchsticks and a face that looked like it belonged in a library rather than on a working farm, he cut an unlikely figure among the robust farmhands of Clearwater Valley. His pale skin burned easily under the Nebraska sun, and his soft hands bore fresh calluses from 6 months of manual labor that his body still wasn't used to. The other workers at Mackenzie family farms treated him like an unwelcome curiosity. While they shared stories about high school football glory days and weekend bar fights, Zephyr kept his head down and focused on his tasks. He'd moved to Clearwater Valley from the East Coast after his grandmother's death left him her small property, hoping for a fresh start and honest work that didn't require explaining his past. What none of them knew was that beneath his bookish exterior lay years of elite wrestling training. From middle school through college, Zephyr had dominated on the mats, earning All-American honors and nearly making the Olympic team before a knee injury ended his competitive career. His slight build had always been deceptive. What he lacked in bulk, he made up for in technique, leverage, and an almost supernatural understanding of body mechanics. But Zephyr had sworn off competition after his injury, tired of the pressure and politics that surrounded elite athletics. He'd come to Nebraska seeking simplicity and anonymity, wanting nothing more than to work with his hands and disappear into small-town normalcy. That peace was about to be shattered. Colt Brenneman emerged from the main farmhouse like he owned the entire county, which in many ways he did. His family's operation dwarfed every other farm in the valley, and at 6'3", with the kind of broad shoulders that came from a lifetime of heavy lifting, he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His truck, boots, and attitude all broadcast the same message. This was his territory and everyone else was just visiting. "Look what we got here," Wade Hutchinson called out, nudging his friend as they watched Zephyr struggle with a particularly heavy feed sack. Wade worked for Colt's father, but acted like he was family, his loyalty buying him protection and status among the valley's social hierarchy. "City boy's still pretending he knows farm work," Colt observed with amusement. "Bet he's never seen a real day's labor in his life." Tessa Kirkland laughed from her perch on Colt's truck tailgate, her perfectly curled hair somehow staying pristine despite the afternoon heat. As the banker's daughter, she divided her time between looking down on working people and slumming with Colt because his family's money impressed her. Maybe we should offer him some pointers, show him how real farm work gets done. Zephyr heard every word, but continued loading feed, his jaw set in determination. He'd dealt with their type before in college, entitled athletes who thought athletic ability gave them license to terrorize anyone they perceived as weak. The harassment started with small things, tools mysteriously going missing from his workstation, his lunch disappearing from the breakroom refrigerator, snide comments about his technique that gradually escalated to outright mockery. The incidents multiplied over the following weeks. They'd sabotage his equipment so jobs took twice as long, then complain to the foreman about his efficiency. They'd assign him the heaviest, dirtiest tasks while taking credit for his completed work. Worst of all, they'd wait until he was struggling with something difficult, then make a show of helping in ways that made him look even more incompetent. The breaking point came during the annual Harvest Festival at the county fairgrounds. Every farm in the valley participated, and Zephyr had volunteered to help set up the Mackenzie booth, hoping to finally fit in with his co-workers. He was arranging produce displays when he spotted Colt's group approaching with predatory grins. "Well, if it isn't our favorite city boy," Colt announced loud enough for half the fairgrounds to hear. "Trying to play farmer for the tourists?" Families with children turned to watch the entertainment. Local teenagers pulled out phones. Even the elderly volunteers running adjacent booths paused their work to see what would happen next. Just setting up the display, Zephyr replied quietly, continuing to arrange apples and corn. That's not how you do it, Tessa declared with theatrical authority. Here, let me show you the right way. Before he could protest, she grabbed the edge of his carefully arranged table display and yanked. Apples cascaded across the grass while ears of corn rolled in every direction. The crowd gasped, then began laughing as Zephyr scrambled to collect the scattered produce. Oops, she said with mock concern. Guess city hands aren't steady enough for real farm work. The laughter grew louder as Zephyr crawled around gathering apples, his face burning with humiliation. But as he stood up, Wade stepped behind him and hooked his foot around Zephyr's ankle. Already off balance from the produce pickup, Zephyr stumbled forward directly into Colt's waiting arms. "Whoa there, buddy," Colt said with false concern as he caught him. "Better be careful. Don't want you hurting yourself." Then his grip shifted, powerful hands moving to Zephyr's throat. "Actually," Colt continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that only Zephyr could hear, "maybe you do need to get hurt. Learn your place around here." His thumbs pressed into Zephyr's windpipe, cutting off air while maintaining the pretense of helping him. To the crowd, it looked like Colt was steadying the clumsy farmhand. Only Zephyr could feel the deliberate pressure, the calculated cruelty disguised as assistance. "Can't breathe very well, can you?" Colt murmured. "That's what happens to people who don't know when they're not wanted." Spots danced in Zephyr's vision as oxygen became scarce. His body's natural panic response kicked in, but underneath the fear, something else stirred. Muscle memory from thousands of hours on wrestling mats, the familiar sensation of an opponent trying to dominate him through superior size and position. The crowd was still laughing, still taking pictures, completely unaware that they were witnessing an assault disguised as slapstick comedy. "Stop!" Zephyr managed to gasp, but Colt's grip only tightened. "What's that?" "Can't hear you. Maybe you should speak up." That's when something snapped inside Zephyr's mind. Not anger or rage, but clarity. Cold, tactical awareness that cut through the panic like a blade through silk. His grandmother's last words echoed in his memory. "Sometimes, Zeph, you have to remind the world that still waters run deep." Zephyr stopped struggling against Colt's grip and instead stepped backward, using the bigger man's forward lean against him. Then he reached up, grabbed Colt's wrists, and executed a perfect lateral drop that sent both of them crashing to the ground. The impact knocked Colt's hands away from his throat, but Zephyr wasn't finished. As they hit the dirt, he rolled through the momentum, came up on top, and trapped Colt's arm in a chicken wing hold that would have made his old wrestling coach proud. The fairgrounds went silent, except for the sound of Colt Brenneman, the valley's golden boy, the untouchable farm prince, gasping in pain as someone half his size controlled him completely. "Let me go," Colt demanded, but his voice came out as more of a wheeze. "When I'm ready." Zephyr adjusted his position, applying textbook pressure that made Colt's entire body tense with discomfort. "See, the thing about bullying someone is you should probably make sure they don't know how to fight back." Wade started forward to help his friend, but stopped when he saw the look in Zephyr's eyes. It wasn't anger or cruelty. It was the focused calm of someone completely in control of the situation. "Where did you learn to do that?" Tessa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "State champion wrestler," Zephyr replied without taking his attention off Colt. 4 years running. Nearly made the Olympic team before I got injured." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people processed this information. The scrawny city boy they'd been laughing at moments before was suddenly revealed as an elite athlete who'd been holding back. "That's impossible," Wade protested. "You're too small to be a wrestler." "Tell that to all the guys twice my size who thought the same thing," Zephyr said. "Weight classes exist for a reason, but technique beats size every time when you know what you're doing." He released Colt's arm and stood up, offering his hand to help the bigger man to his feet. After a moment's hesitation, Colt accepted the assistance, looking dazed and confused. "Why didn't you fight back before?" Colt asked, rubbing his shoulder. "Because I didn't want to hurt anyone," Zephyr replied simply. "I came here for peace, not conflict, but choking someone crosses a line from bullying into assault." The crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the fairgrounds. Families with children watched with fascination as the dynamic between the three shifted dramatically. "You embarrassed me," Colt said, his voice growing harder as he processed what had happened. "You embarrassed yourself," Zephyr corrected. "I just defended myself when you put your hands on my throat." "This isn't over," Wade added, moving to stand beside his friend. "Actually, it is," said a new voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Emma Rodriguez approaching with determined steps. Zephyr's heart jumped as he recognized the veterinarian who'd been called to the Mackenzie farm several times over the past months. She was everything Tessa wasn't: genuine kindness instead of manufactured sweetness, calloused hands that spoke of real work instead of manicured nails that had never touched dirt. "Emma, this doesn't involve you," Colt warned. "It does when I watch 3 people gang up on someone who was just trying to do his job," she replied firmly. "I saw the whole thing from the livestock barn. Saw you grab his throat when he couldn't defend himself. That was just fooling around," Tessa protested. "Boys being boys." "Boys being boys doesn't involve cutting off someone's air supply," Emma shot back. "That's called assault. And there are 50 witnesses here who can testify to what really happened." One by one, voices from the crowd began speaking up. The elderly woman running the pie contest had seen Colt's grip on Zephyr's throat. The teenagers with phones had recorded the entire incident. Even some of Colt's usual supporters looked uncomfortable with how far things had gone. "He started it by disrespecting our way of life," Wade insisted, but his conviction was wavering. "He started it by existing," Emma corrected. "And you 3 have been making his life miserable for months because he's different from what you're used to." Zephyr felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. For months, he'd felt isolated and alone, like no one in the valley cared what happened to the quiet outsider. Now Emma was standing up for him in front of half the county. "Thank you," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. She smiled back, and he realized that beneath her professional confidence lay genuine affection. The conversations they'd shared during her veterinary visits hadn't just been polite small talk. There had been real connection there, real mutual interest that went beyond discussing sick cattle. "Don't thank me yet," Emma replied. "Thank me when these 3 learn to leave you alone." Colt's face flushed red with humiliation as he realized the crowd's sympathy had shifted completely. Parents were shaking their heads in disapproval. His own workers were avoiding eye contact. Even the county fair officials were approaching to investigate the disturbance. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "What's ridiculous," said the fair's head organizer as she reached the group, "is grown people disrupting a family event with this kind of behavior. Colt Brenneman, I'm disappointed in you. Your father raised you better than this." The public scolding hit harder than any physical blow Zephyr could have delivered. In a community where reputation mattered more than money, being dressed down by a respected elder in front of half the county was devastating. Over the following weeks, the dynamic in Clearwater Valley transformed completely. Word of the fairgrounds incident spread through the farming community like wildfire, but the story that emerged wasn't about a fight. It was about restraint, about someone with the skills to seriously hurt his attackers, choosing mercy instead. Colt and his crew found their social standing diminished. Other workers who'd once laughed at their antics now viewed them with suspicion. The story of how the quiet city boy had dominated Colt Brenneman while showing remarkable self-control became local legend. For Zephyr, everything changed. His co-workers began including him in conversations, asking about his wrestling background and treating him with newfound respect. The work itself became easier as people stopped sabotaging his efforts and started offering genuine help when he needed it. The biggest change was Emma. What had started as professional visits to check on livestock evolved into lengthy conversations about everything from agricultural science to their shared love of old movies. She began timing her farm calls to coincide with his lunch breaks, and their friendship deepened into something neither had quite named yet. 2 months after the fairgrounds incident, Zephyr was repairing fence line behind the main barn when he saw Emma's truck approaching. She parked and walked over with a troubled expression that immediately put him on alert. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "What's wrong?" "Colt and his friends have been spreading rumors about me around town, saying I'm dating you to get back at them for some imagined slight." Her voice was steady, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. "My boss called me into his office yesterday, said some clients are questioning whether I can be professional with male farmers." Zephyr felt anger building in his chest, not the wild rage that led to poor decisions, but the focused fury that had made him dangerous on wrestling mats. "They're trying to hurt you to get to me," he said. "That's what I figured. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before he could answer, the sound of truck engines filled the air. 3 vehicles pulled up in a cloud of dust, Colt's oversized pickup flanked by Wade's Jeep and Tessa's convertible. "Perfect timing," Colt called out as he climbed from his truck. "Just the 2 people we wanted to see." Wade and Tessa flanked him as they approached, their confidence noticeably forced compared to their old swagger. The fairgrounds incident had shaken them, but apparently not enough to end their campaign of harassment. "Emma, I heard you've been telling people around town that we assaulted your boyfriend," Tessa said with false sweetness. "I told people the truth," Emma replied firmly, "that I watched you 3 attack someone who was just trying to work." "Attack?" Wade laughed harshly. "We were just having some fun. City boy here got his feelings hurt and made a big deal out of nothing." "You choked him," Emma said flatly, "in front of 50 witnesses." "That's your version," Colt replied, his old arrogance returning as he sensed what he thought was an advantage. "But see, the thing is, people around here have known my family for generations. They trust us. They don't trust outsiders who show up and start causing trouble." "What trouble?" Zephyr asked, stepping protectively closer to Emma. "The trouble of you existing here," Colt said bluntly. "Coming into our valley, taking jobs from local people, and now turning our women against us with your sob stories." "Your women?" Emma's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Did you just refer to me as your property?" "You know what I meant." "Actually, I don't. Why don't you explain it to me?" Colt's face reddened as he realized his mistake, but Wade jumped in to support his friend. "What he means is you're from here. You belong with your own kind, not with some weakling outsider who can't even do real farm work." "My own kind." Emma's professional composure was cracking. "And what kind is that exactly?" Tessa sensed the conversation spiraling and tried to redirect. "We're just looking out for you, Emma, trying to save you from making a mistake with someone who obviously doesn't fit in here." "The only mistake I see," Emma replied, "is 3 people who think they have the right to decide who belongs in this valley and who doesn't." "We have more right than him," Colt said, pointing at Zephyr. "Our families built this place. We earned our spot here." "And what have you done to earn anything?" Emma asked, "besides inherit land and money from people who actually worked for what they had?" The insult hit its mark. Colt's face went from red to purple, and Zephyr could see his hands clenching into fists. "That's enough," Colt said through gritted teeth. "Time to settle this once and for all." "Settle what?" Zephyr asked, but he was already shifting his stance, muscle memory preparing his body for conflict. Settle whether you belong in this valley, Wade answered. Settle whether you're good enough for our Emma. She's not your Emma, Zephyr said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. We'll see about that. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Wade made the first move, rushing forward with his fists raised in what he probably thought was an intimidating charge. Zephyr sidestepped at the last second, grabbed Wade's extended arm, and used the man's own momentum to send him flying face first into the mud beside the fence line. Tessa screamed as Wade hit the ground with a splash that sent dirty water flying in all directions. "Wade!" Colt shouted, but his attention was divided between his friend and the small man who'd just demonstrated that the fairgrounds incident hadn't been luck. "Your turn," Zephyr said calmly, settling into a wrestling stance that suddenly made his slight build look dangerous instead of fragile. Colt charged with more caution than Wade had shown, but he was still thinking like a brawler instead of a trained fighter. Zephyr ducked under his wild swing, shot in for a double-leg takedown, and lifted the bigger man off his feet before driving him backward into the wooden fence with a crash that shook the entire structure. "Jesus," Emma breathed, watching Colt slide down the fence posts like a broken marionette, but Zephyr wasn't finished. As Colt tried to get his bearings, Zephyr grabbed him by the shirt and hauled him to his feet with surprising strength. "You want to know what I learned from wrestling?" he asked, his voice still perfectly calm. "It's not about size or strength. It's about leverage, timing, and technique." He demonstrated by executing a perfect hip toss that sent Colt flying through the air to land with a tremendous splash in the muddiest part of the pig pen area. The impact sent mud flying in all directions, coating Tessa's designer clothes and turning Colt's pristine appearance into a brown, dripping mess. "And the most important thing," Zephyr continued as Colt floundered in the muck, "is knowing when to stop." Wade had recovered enough to get back to his feet, but he was covered in mud and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You want some more?" Zephyr asked, and Wade shook his head quickly. "We're done," Wade said, helping his friend climb out of the mud. "Good," Zephyr replied, "because if this happens again, I won't be so gentle." Tessa backed away toward her car, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "You're crazy," she accused. "Both of you are crazy." "We're people who won't be pushed around anymore," Emma corrected. "Maybe you should learn the difference." As the three bullies gathered themselves and retreated to their vehicles, covered in mud and humiliation, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people approached to congratulate Zephyr and Emma on standing up for themselves. "That was something else," said Mrs. Patterson from the next farm over. "About time someone taught those three some manners." "Your wrestling days weren't as far behind you as you thought," Emma observed with a smile as they watched the bullies drive away. "Apparently not," Zephyr agreed. "Though I'd hoped I'd never need those skills again." "Sometimes life doesn't give us a choice about the fights that find us," Emma said, moving closer to him. "But it does give us a choice about how we handle them." "And how do you think I handled it?" "Like someone who knows the difference between strength and cruelty," she replied. "You could have really hurt them, but you didn't. That says more about your character than any wrestling trophy ever could." Over the next several months, Clearwater Valley settled into a new normal. Colt Brenneman found his social standing significantly diminished, his family's money unable to buy back the respect he'd lost. Wade discovered that loyalty to the wrong person could be costly and began working harder to prove his worth through actual effort rather than association. Tessa left town altogether, deciding that rural life wasn't as romantic as she'd imagined. For Zephyr, the transformation was profound. His co-workers began treating him as an equal, seeking his input on projects and including him in their social gatherings. The story of the mud pen incident became local folklore, but the version that endured wasn't about violence. It was about a quiet man who'd shown remarkable restraint when pushed to his limit. The most meaningful change was his relationship with Emma. Their friendship had evolved into something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than sympathy or protective instincts. She'd been attracted to his gentleness from the beginning, but seeing his strength when it mattered had sealed her admiration. 6 months after the fairgrounds incident, Zephyr was finishing his evening chores when he spotted a familiar scene developing near the equipment barn. A new farmhand, barely out of high school by the look of him, was being surrounded by some local troublemakers who apparently hadn't gotten the message about how things worked in the valley now. This time, Zephyr didn't hesitate. "Problem here?" he asked, approaching the group with the quiet confidence he'd learned to carry. The would-be bullies recognized him immediately. Word of the Colt Brenneman takedown had spread far beyond Clearwater Valley, becoming the stuff of regional legend. "No, sir," one of them said quickly, "just talking to the new guy." "Good, because farmhands look out for each other around here," Zephyr said, placing a protective hand on the newcomer's shoulder. "We don't tolerate people who pick on others just because they're new or different." The group scattered without another word, leaving the young farmhand looking at Zephyr with gratitude and amazement. "How did you do that?" he asked. "By learning that sometimes you have to stand up even when you'd rather walk away," Zephyr replied. "But the key is remembering that the goal isn't to become what you're fighting against." As he drove home that evening, Emma following in her truck to help him finish painting his grandmother's old house, Zephyr reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd come to Nebraska seeking anonymity and found community instead. He'd tried to avoid conflict and learned that sometimes controlled confrontation was the most peaceful option available. Most importantly, he'd discovered that true strength wasn't about dominating others or proving superiority. It was about protecting those who needed protection, standing up for what was right, and knowing when to show mercy to those who'd shown you none. His wrestling trophies sat in boxes, but these days he carried that mindset differently, not as weapons to be feared, but as tools for justice. Because in a valley where respect had to be earned, Zephyr Whitlock had earned his the hard way, and learned to wear it with dignity his grandmother would have been proud to see.